province gets up and that cabinet wakes up, they should be asking themselves, how can we make Nova Scotia a leader on whatever issue it is? You know, on healthcare. There are so many provinces over the years that have moved to other ways of dealing with healthcare, alternative service delivery, and yet this province is happy to take the cash from the federal government and not really talk about the reforms that are necessary to maintain our public system. 6 months, Mr. Speaker, would give the province an opportunity to give the feedback to this weak government that they should be hearing about this law. You know, Mr. Speaker, education is another one. The students in the former county of Halifax are probably the lowest funded per student students in the country. In the country. My children happen to go to school in the former county, Mr. Speaker. I see every day the challenges that we face as having the poorest funded schools in the country. And yet, this government and that minister, when they wake up, don't stand up and say, how can we become leaders on this issue? They talk about other issues. They talk about nibbling around the edges. They talk about half measures. They talk about, you know, as the Dutch boy, sticking the finger in the dike to stop the dam from breaking, instead of talking about how we can build a new dam. But this government, Mr. Speaker, ignores those problems that every day I hear in the coffee shops, I hear in my office, I hear when I go out to events in my ridings, people complaining about the funding of their systems, whether it's education or healthcare or our democracy. How many times have we had people talk to us about the fact that we needed more free votes in this House? Or maybe we needed to have, you know, a better system of ensuring accountability. And yet, Mr. Speaker, what we get from this government is backroom deals that don't have any consultation. Mr. Speaker, the motion that was moved by the leader of my party would give us 6 months to talk about that, and I think that's what we should be doing. Absolutely. You know, Mr. Speaker, there's other issues as well that this province is lacking leadership on that also are indicative of why this government is failing the people of Nova Scotia. And again, this bill is a symptom of a bigger problem. And 6 months of being able to study this bill may be the wake-up call this government needs to understand that the whole problem, not just the symptom, this bill needs to be addressed. You know, there are people in this House, I think the member from Pictou East introduced a resolution today on internet access in rural areas. You know, for a party that particularly...
Order, please.
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member speak to the reason for the hoist, not other parliamentary business.
Right. So, Mr. Speaker, we have a motion before the House for 6 months delay. Maybe that 6 months delay as part of talking about democratic renewal, talking about campaign finance, can also talk about the fact that how we may be able to use the internet and spread the internet throughout Nova Scotia to ensure that Nova Scotians have access to a democracy that is not only a democracy for the 1970s or the 1980s, but is a democracy for the next century. And that's why we need 6 months to talk about that, Mr. Speaker, to talk about how, as a province, instead of being at the back of the pack, we can talk about being leaders. Talk about, for 6 months, how this province, whether it's democratic renewal or other issues, can become a province, again, like Joseph Howe had in 1848, a province of leadership, a province that ensured that we were at the cutting edge with regard to democratic renewal. That is what is needed. That is what the people of Nova Scotia, I suspect, would be demanding if they had 6 months to talk about it. But instead, we have a bill tabled in this House on Friday, and we're asked to pass it by the end of this week. And when we talk about wanting to delay it, we get harumphing and we get concern and consternation from the Liberals and Tories, Mr. Speaker, because they believe a delay is bad. Well, Mr. Speaker, I would argue, again, that any time a government wants to rush through a piece of legislation, it's our job in opposition to pause, to review it with diligence, and to determine whether or not this is the appropriate legislation for Nova Scotians. There's a lot more that can be done with regard to campaign finance reform, and 6 months will give us a chance to do that, Mr. Speaker. Give the people of Nova Scotia a chance to be part of that process. You know, Mr. Speaker, I've had an opportunity in the past 5 years from time to time to do a bit of comparison shopping with regard to democracies. I've had an opportunity, I'm very proud of the opportunities I've had to see how democracy works in parts of the third world and some of the legislation they've put in place in the third world to avoid corruption, to ensure oversight and accountability, to ensure that their democracies are functioning properly. Mr. Speaker, and in the 6 months that Nova Scotians have on this legislation, It would give them an opportunity to also have that comparison of how things work, whether it's in Europe or whether it's in Middle East or whether it's in Asia. There are many emerging democracies that have dealt with the issues that we should be dealing with, frankly, on a regular basis. Yet instead of waiting 6 months to hear from Nova Scotians and talking about it as a full-blown consultation, we have a process that, frankly, in most, if not all, of the third world, in places where they actually consider themselves a democracy, this kind of process would be laughed at. This would be considered a process that is not democratic. This would be considered a process that does not meet the minimum standard with regard to consultation on electoral reform legislation. I've seen it. I've seen what their legislation is, and I know full well that this doesn't meet the standard. And yet in this province, we have a government, again, a weak government, that is prepared to accept this in order to ensure that they buy 6 months more of their life with regard to a budget that they think will be passed if they pass this law. That's not the way for a democracy to work. That's not the way for us to ensure that the people of Nova Scotia can have faith that when laws are being changed around election reform, that they're not laws that are going to benefit one party or two parties or three parties. They should be laws that ensure that there's fair and equitable funding, and that there will ensure that everyone who wants to get involved in the political process in this province, Mr. Speaker, will have an opportunity to do that. That's what 6 months will give the people of Nova Scotia an opportunity to have feedback on. They can tell this government what they think with regard to this issue. And there's no other legislation, I would argue, that's more important with regard to consultation than this legislation, Mr. Speaker. That is what Nova Scotians need to be looking at. That is what the people of Nova Scotia need to be thinking about. And I would argue that that is what the people of Nova Scotia are demanding. The more they look at this legislation, the more they are going to want to ensure that this is something that can be done. Mr. Speaker, that is why I want to ensure that the people of Nova Scotia have this chance. 6 months will give them that opportunity. And Mr. Speaker, that is why we need to delay this bill, to give them that opportunity. It's only consultation that frankly should have occurred beforehand. It's only consultation that should have happened, Mr. Speaker, before this bill ever saw the light of day in this House. It's consultation that should have happened before the Liberals and Tories sat down and worked out a deal on a napkin. That's the legislation that should have been developed. That's the legislation the people of Nova Scotia would have wanted to see. And yet, unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, that's not what they're seeing. And 6 months would give them that opportunity, Mr. Speaker. And as I said, from my experiences in other countries, I know that, generally speaking, electoral laws are not done in back rooms. There has to be a certain amount of consensus. And that is something, Mr. Speaker, that has not been done with regard to this legislation. The people of Nova Scotia are being asked to blindly accept that this is good for them without ever really having an opportunity to think about it, that sober second thought that can be important in this process. Because as I said earlier, there are a lot of laws, Mr. Speaker, that I think can result in a lot of laws in this province, Mr. Speaker, that this government is introducing. And if this government introduces them, in most cases we find there need to be changes to them. That the laws are shoddily drafted, the instructions are bad, and we end up having to fix them a year later, Mr. Speaker. 6 months of delay on this bill would ensure that Nova Scotians could have a very close look, a scrutiny of this legislation to ensure it's good for every Nova Scotian, anyone who wants to get involved in the political process. You know, 20 years ago, maybe even 10 to some extent, but 20, who would have thought that the compilation of this House would be what it would be today? No one would have thought that we would have 20 seats. There are people in this province that would have laughed at that thought. And Mr. Speaker, the fact is that 20 years from now, we don't know what this province is going to look like. Maybe the Green Party will be government. Maybe there'll be another party we never heard of. Maybe there'll be a merger of all these three parties. We don't know. And the fact is that when we make changes to laws like this, they do impact for generations, not for years. And this government has to understand that. These Nova Scotia compromises, these short, quick solutions that are half measures, sweeping things under the rug in hopes of some political lifeline being handed to them, are not the answer. And 6 months of debate amongst the people of Nova Scotia can ensure that we'll all have a chance to ensure that this is a law that's good for Nova Scotia for the next generation, for whoever sits in this House, whichever party is government, however we decide we're going to govern ourselves.
Make a great minister.
It's not about entrenching the rights of some parties over others. Maybe entrenching the rights of any party over anyone else. It's about building a democracy that ensures equity, that ensures the people of Nova Scotia have a chance to be part of the democratic process. And I assure you, for the Minister of Finance to stand in this House and say we need to talk about, because of declining voter turnout, more things about democratic renewal, I agree. This bill isn't going to cut it. A sense that that the three parties are going to pass a bill in a matter of days without any firm debate amongst the people of Nova Scotia for the 6 months that it requires, Mr. Speaker, I would argue is only sending a further message that they're not really a part of this process. That it's a game of baseball played by three parties. That the people really don't deserve to be involved, that this is going to happen anyway. We're all taking our cut of the pie, and thank you very much. Maybe they'll vote for us next time because we're the least bad of a bunch. But that's not democratic reform. And 6 months, Mr. Speaker, will give the people of Nova Scotia a chance to actually have that input. And I would argue it's good for Nova Scotians to have that input, Mr. Speaker. I know I'm winding down my time, but how much time do I have left? 2 or 3 minutes?
6:12.
Sorry? 6:12? Thank you.
Oh, that's only another minute.
So,
We just got started.
Mr. Speaker, we're a province that were, frankly, world leaders with regard to democracy in the middle of the 19th century. Joseph Howe, freedom of speech. Joseph Howe, UNIAC, independent, de facto government, first in the colony, first independent colony without shedding any blood, without any violence, Mr. Speaker. What has happened to the Nova Scotia of the mid-1800s? Why have we allowed it to slip to the point where instead of talking about renewal, talking about democracy, talking about being, geez, I would like to be a regional leader, maybe a Canadian leader, let alone a world leader. Why can't we talk about democracy reform in those terms? Why can't we recapture what Joseph Howe and others fought so hard for in the middle of the 19th century? Why can we not, as a legislature, give the people of Nova Scotia 6 months to be part of a process that ensures that we not only talk about a backroom deal that helps some, but can actually build a democracy for the next generation that will make Nova Scotians proud of their province the way we're proud of Joseph Howe. Mr. Speaker, that's what people of Nova Scotia are demanding. That is why we've moved this motion, and I'm glad to support the motion. Thank you.
Very well done.
The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm certainly very pleased to have an opportunity to stand here in my place and engage in a debate which I think is very, very important. Mr. Speaker, there's a lot of uncertainties in politics, as we all know, but there's one certainty that I have come to rely on since I've been in this place, and that it's if the Tory government can get it wrong, they will. They generally do on their first attempt, and it's often up to us here on this side of the House in the NDP caucus to help them do the right thing, Mr. Speaker. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, I fully support the motion that was made by the Leader of the Official Opposition to essentially hoist Bill 117 for thorough public and other forms of consultation. Now, Mr. Speaker, I hear members of the government say that this is delay tactics. Now, Mr. Speaker, please, please. This is one of the most important opportunities that the people in the province of Nova Scotia have had in a number of years to actually engage in a public debate about how political parties and elections in their province are funded, Mr. Speaker. And I can think of no more important issue to engage with the public in my constituency and in other parts of the province, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when the minister stood in his place here on second reading, he talked about the concerns that he and members of his party have with respect to the future of the democratic process in this province. And I believe, in spite of whatever ideological or partisan differences there may be between the three different parties that are represented here in this House of Assembly, there is one thing I think we absolutely all share, and that is a passion for democracy and a very, very fundamental and strong commitment to the political process and to this province and the people who we represent, Mr. Speaker. And this, in fact, Mr. Speaker, is what this debate is all about and what it goes to the heart of. And Mr. Speaker, this is legislation that requires broad public consultation and involvement, which is exactly what the motion that's before us this evening is designed to do, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, all across this country, in other provinces, at a provincial level, and indeed at a federal level, there is an ongoing debate about the democratic deficit. Mr. Speaker, in the last provincial election that we all went through quite recently back in June, the number of people in our province who went out and voted in that election fell. And it fell again for probably the third or the fourth, maybe even the fifth consecutive election. This is something that we have to take very seriously. Mr. Speaker, the other day I was looking at the results from my own constituency, the beautiful constituency of Halifax, Needham, North, and a little bit of central Halifax. And Mr. Speaker, that's the constituency where we make ships and beer. I don't believe there are any other MLAs that have an opportunity to stand in their place and say that. But Mr. Speaker, the sad reality is for the first time in my memory, Mr. Speaker, less than 50% of the eligible voters actually participated in that election, Mr. Speaker. And I see this opportunity with the Bill 117 to actually go out into my constituency and initiate a really important and a very vibrant discussion about why that is and what we need to do to change the dropping participation rate of people in the political process. And Mr. Speaker, there's no doubt about it that there's a cynicism about political parties, there's a cynicism about campaign financing, there's a cynicism about the involvement of corporations and big money in political parties. There's a cynicism about trade unions being involved in political parties. You know, I've been involved in election campaigns in the province of Nova Scotia since the early 70s, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I ran in my first election in 1984. Mr. Speaker, I ran against Edmund Morris and Walter Fitzgerald. I used to tell people it was a real horse race, me and two old mares. And Mr. Speaker, I remember how profoundly uncomfortable I was asking people for money to make a political donation to my campaign. I remember, Mr. Speaker, coming back from knocking on doors one evening and my campaign manager asking me, Mr. Speaker, how much money I had raised. And I said, I can't ask people for money. And my manager said, Maureen, you have to remember Tommy Douglas built this party with nickels and dimes from the farmers. You ask people for money. Well, Mr. Speaker, on some level that strengthened my resolve to go out there and ask people. I mean, after all, if Tommy Douglas was able to do that as a way to build our great party and to forward our movement, then surely I could do this as well. But Mr. Speaker, the times have changed so profoundly since those days when Tommy Douglas was going door to door, you know, pretty much during a depression or following a depression, looking for nickels and dimes from the farmers. I think today the public are quite concerned about the extent to which they certainly perceive that big money controls political parties. And Mr. Speaker, if we ever had a time to take legislation on the floor of this legislation, improve it, and improve the political process by getting the public involved in giving us their views, then now is the time. Mr. Speaker, I would very much like an opportunity to talk to people in my riding about how they feel about the public being involved in public funding of political parties. Mr. Speaker, you know, people don't necessarily understand how our current political system works. Even sometimes people who are in active politics don't even understand all of the mechanisms for how our current political system works. The reality, Mr. Speaker, is there's a certain amount of public funding in our current political system right now. And it's political funding that's there and available to the parties through the political tax credit system. And Mr. Speaker, there has often been concern expressed by members of the public. You see it in letters to the newspaper, and it's raised with me different times, that political parties get a more favorable treatment sometimes around political contributions than contributions to charities. Mr. Speaker, if we hoisted this bill for 6 months and undertook a consultation process, we would really have an opportunity to look at what kind of fairness and equity there is right now in the political tax credit system. I mean, what Bill 117 is actually doing, Mr. Speaker, is it's increasing the tax credit for political contributions. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, Mr. Speaker, but I would very much like to know what members of my constituency think about that vis-a-vis their commitments to making charitable tax contributions and what it is they receive through the charitable tax system. And Mr. Speaker, this gives us a perfect opportunity to go out and find out what people think. Mr. Speaker, there are many features of this bill that require much more extensive discussion. One of the things about our current system has no limits on the amount of money you can contribute to a political party. If somebody wanted to give $10,000 or $40,000 or $50,000 or more, in fact, there is no limit. And this piece of legislation imposes a $5,000, an annual limit of $5,000. Now, Mr. Speaker, on the face, that seems like certainly a move in the right direction. But I think we need to go out in the province of Nova Scotia and talk to Nova Scotia citizens about whether or not they think $5,000 is excessive as a form of political contribution. Mr. Speaker, the federal legislation that is currently making its way, I think it has passed the House of Commons, but it's currently in the Senate, actually sets a limit of $1,000. And Mr. Speaker, there's a reason for that. There's a reason why the amount hasn't been set at a much higher level. And Mr. Speaker, I'd like to make reference to a very good article that was in the journal Policy Options in October of this year. And when I complete my intervention here this evening, I will be very happy to table this article. I'm assuming that members of the Liberal Party might want to read this article because it's written by a very well-known Liberal, although the honourable member from Kings South Cape Breton South doesn't seem to be too interested in knowing what's happening in terms of advice to the Liberal Party from a prominent Liberal. But anyway, Mr. Speaker, this is written by Tom Kent, and Tom Kent will be known to many members of this legislature. He was a former senior advisor to Lester Pearson when Pearson was the Prime Minister, and the members of the Liberal Party often like to portray Mr. Kent as the father of social policy in Canada, and in fact, he did have significant influence in many of our social programs, and continues to be way more progressive than most members of the Liberal Party today, with one or two notable exceptions who don't necessarily come from that party. Anyway, Mr. Speaker, he has quite an interesting piece on campaign finance reform in this particular. So, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is what Mr. Kent says, and I think this is something that we could take to the public for more discussion, because he says that there are two distinct kinds of campaign financing.
The very best they got.
There are two distinct kinds of campaign financing, Mr. Speaker, and we need to distinguish. We need to distinguish between people, and we need to distinguish between corporate sources of campaign financing. And this is what he says, and I quote, "Political parties are voluntary associations of people sharing some views about public policies. In a free society, it's unthinkable that their members and sympathizers should be barred from contributing to their expenses. The issue can only be a matter of degree." And he goes on to talk about to what extent, where should the ceilings be set, Mr. Speaker, in terms of how much money you should accept. And he says personal donations may be a laundering of money from richer people or corporations if you set the limits too high, Mr. Speaker. And he argues for more modest limits because he says that it's a much easier system to police and oversee. And Mr. Speaker, I would suggest to you that that's the kind of system that members of our province, that the public in our province would have an opportunity to comment on. And absolutely, if we had the 6-month period to go out into the community, we could talk to people about the various ways that you can make a system more clean, more transparent, and more accessible. Mr. Speaker, I cannot think of too many individuals who live in my constituency who would be in a position to make a $5,000 donation annually to any political party in this province, regardless of what the tax credit might be, Mr. Speaker. That ceiling seems to be excessive, and that's something that we really should be out in our communities consulting on, Mr. Speaker. The minister's bill, the government bill, doesn't limit who can make these contributions. And so political parties, so corporations and trade unions are given the same status as citizens. And Mr. Speaker, that is very problematic. If we're going to be serious about electoral campaign finance reform, then surely that's the crux of the matter. We value our democratic system. Our democratic system is based on a belief that there's equality between people on the basis of one person, one vote. Mr. Speaker, a few elections ago, I was invited to go speak with a group of young people who frankly could be characterized as very, very disaffected youth. They were primarily people who were eligible to vote and had been eligible to vote in a previous election, and they hadn't. And they didn't intend to in the one where I went to speak with them. And I said to these young people, I said, why on earth, on the one day when you are as equal as any other person in our province, regardless of your race, regardless of how much money you have in your bank account, regardless of your level of educational attainment, for this one day, you are equal in front of the law in our province in terms of your right to go and make your voice heard. Why would you give that up? And Mr. Speaker, many of the young people in the room looked at me, and they hadn't really thought of that, Mr. Speaker. It hadn't really occurred to them that that is the basis of our system. That no matter how rich you are, no matter how well-educated formally you may have been, no matter what opportunities you may have had in life by virtue of your gender, your race, your social class, in a democracy, for that one moment, there actually is some equality. But, Mr. Speaker, many, many people give that up. They give that one moment up. They don't exercise their franchise, and they have become very disillusioned with the system. And, Mr. Speaker, we have an opportunity. We have a unique opportunity with this bill, with a government that has some political will to actually do something about the democratic deficit in this province. But, Mr. Speaker, it has to be done right. It has to be done right. And I can assure you, Mr. Speaker, that in my constituency, on that day, with those young people in the room who I spoke to, if I went and told them that the democratic deficit has been addressed because we've set a $5,000 limit on campaign financing in the province of Nova Scotia, they'd look at me like I was sort of a lunatic. Because it's meaningless. It's meaningless to the vast majority of people in this province. There are very few people in this province who have that kind of disposable income that they can hand it over to a political party during an election or between electoral years. So, Mr. Speaker, we have an opportunity here to really address democratic problems in the province, but we need to do them properly. And the way to go about that, Mr. Speaker, is to have a process that really is consultative, that goes out and that uses all of the tools that are available to us in terms of having this conversation with the public. Mr. Speaker, I really don't think that 52 men and women have the right, were sent to this place to, on a Thursday afternoon, to have a piece of legislation of this importance be placed in front of us, and with the objective of the government that they will have it passed within 5 or 6 days, and that's the end of the story. How does that contribute to the problem that the Minister of Finance spoke to when he introduced this bill? How will that address the fundamental cynicism that people have with respect to the political process, it won't address the cynicism, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, the only thing it will do will be contribute to the cynicism. It will absolutely contribute to the cynicism. Now, Mr. Speaker, there are a number of other issues that we could be consulting with the public on with respect to this bill. This bill sets limits of $5,000. It allows corporations and trade unions to continue to make contributions to political parties, even though they're not citizens, and even though they don't have a right to participate in the one person, one vote democracy on which our democracy is based. But Mr. Speaker, this bill would allow children to donate to political parties. There's nothing in this bill that says you have to be a voter. And Mr. Speaker, I think given what we have seen with the debacle around one of the federal leadership candidates and the funneling of money, listen to what Tom Kent again says. Tom Kent talks in this article about controls and about how pretty much every system you develop, or pretty much a lot of the electoral form systems that have been developed, have mechanisms where people will try to get around them. And so he advocates strongly that you need to really pay a lot of attention and tighten up your legislation as much as possible. I mean, Mr. Speaker, if we had 6 months to do some consultation, we could bring Mr. Kent here to the province to consult with. He is a well-known person. He comes to Nova Scotia quite often. I believe he for a time was on the faculty at Dalhousie, perhaps. I think and he's somebody who has given considerable thought to campaign and corporate fundraising. And so certainly, I know he's probably a very busy individual, but surely within a 6-month period, Mr. Speaker, he's somebody who we could we could use as a resource to give us advice. Now, certainly one of the things that he reflects on in this piece is that, when you have legislation on campaign finance reform, certainly you should limit the people who can make financial contributions to a political party to the citizens who can participate in the democracy by having the franchise and who get to vote in the election. And I think perhaps that was the minister's intent in this legislation by saying if you're from out of the province of Nova Scotia, you can't make a political contribution in an election. The Premier is nodding. He's saying that's their intent. So if that's the case, if it's about people who have an interest because they're citizens of the province and they get to vote in the elections, then why would we allow 8-year-olds to make contributions to political parties? Why wouldn't we amend the legislation? And this is something I think we need to go out and have a broader consultation around, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think it requires consultation, particularly since I think the political parties in the province allow young people who are under voting age to be members of their parties. And so we would really, I think, have to look at what age would we allow people to make contributions? Because after all, the point is to tighten up the financing of political parties and to tighten up the financing of campaigns so that we actually have clean politics that are fair, that are open, that are transparent, and that restore people's faith and people's trust in the political process, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, there are a number of other issues that we need to be thinking of. Mr. Speaker, certainly one of the things that I have a personal stake in as a member of this legislature is how does public campaign financing impact constituency associations? Mr. Speaker, and I would like to have 6 months to speak with the members of the Halifax-Needham NDP Constituency Association, that extraordinary team of people who I work with, who are quite amazing in terms of their election abilities. And they need to have an opportunity to talk about this. And, you know, Mr. Speaker, I'm not joking when I talk about the importance of each and every one of us thinking about and going back and talking to people at the constituency level. Mr. Speaker, one of the strengths of the political system historically has been the constituency association and its grassroots characteristics. And Mr. Speaker, there is some concern being expressed by political scientists and policy analysts that public campaign financing, which goes after all to the central bodies of political parties, in fact may erode the grassroots potential of those democratic constituency organizations that come at the constituency level. And you know, Mr. Speaker, from my experience in a constituency like Halifax-Needham, I mean, people sometimes see political parties as being very, very beholding to big interests. But let me tell you, Mr. Speaker, how we raise money at the grassroots level in my constituency. When I was first elected to this place, I wasn't here more than 4 or 5 months. Then Van Morrison came to town. And Mr. Speaker, I got up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I went and I sat in line outside Sobeys with probably 14 or 15, 16-year-old boys who were all there waiting for the ticket counter to open because they were buying tickets for their parents, and I was buying tickets for the NDP caucus and for my constituency association. And we bought a pair of Van Morrison tickets, Mr. Speaker, and we sold tickets on them. We raffled them off. We made about $1,200 or $1,500. And Mr. Speaker, this has been a kind of fundraising effort that
Order,
goes
please.
on.
And this relates to the motion, Hal.
6 months in the line.
Please, the honourable member for Halifax-Needham to the hoist motion before the House.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, absolutely it's important to know that if we had 6 months to consult with the grassroots activists in our constituency associations and in our communities, one of the things that we would certainly be asking people is we'd be asking them for their point of view on the public funding of political parties under Bill 117 and how they see that impacting on their local grassroots activism, Mr. Speaker. And that's the point, Mr. Speaker, that I was trying to make, perhaps in quite a roundabout way, Mr. Speaker, but I have to, yes, in an absolute good way, Mr. Speaker, and the Van Morrison concert was outstanding, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure you'd like to know that, as was the Rolling Stones and a number of other concerts we've sold tickets on. So, Mr. Speaker, this is certainly something that we need to consult more broadly with the people of Nova Scotia and the people who work really hard to make the electoral process work, Mr. Speaker. And they may not be a large group of people, but they are very important, Mr. Speaker, and we owe them all, I think, a debt of gratitude because they haven't given up and on the political process, and they have some hope that things can change. Mr. Speaker, this bill doesn't speak to another issue that has come into focus relatively recently, and it's an issue that we would all share some interest in knowing more from our public around, and that's how convention fees we all have annual conventions, and Mr. Speaker, will they be considered political contributions? If we had an opportunity to consult, then certainly this would be part of the questions that we would ask. Mr. Speaker, how will fundraising dinners be treated? This is something that needs to be discussed, and certainly if we had a 6-month period, we would have an opportunity to go and talk with members of the public around. I would imagine that there are probably more than a few people in the corporate and other communities that would be quite excited about the potential to not have those fundraising dinners anymore, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, we will never know. We will never know how people feel if this piece of legislation is rammed through this legislature without the proper kind of consultation and study and consideration and public debate that it warrants, that such an important piece of legislation warrants, Mr. Speaker. And I think that's why we need to send a clear message to the government that we are prepared to work with them to see a much more open and transparent process, but there are certainly many aspects of this legislation that require more discussion and more thought. Now, Mr. Speaker, I haven't talked at all yet about the problems that Bill 117 represents, not only to myself and members of our caucus, but for the people in the province of Nova Scotia with respect to trust funds, political party trust funds. And Mr. Speaker, if there was ever a matter for public consultation and study, I would suggest to you then that certainly is it. And Mr. Speaker, this is also an issue, once again, that Mr. Kent has made reference to. This is an excellent, excellent piece. This is clearly an individual who has been closely associated with the Liberal Party, who has really given a great deal of consideration to the problems that are associated. And I would very much like an opportunity to have Mr. Kent, to talk to Mr. Kent and to have other people hear from him with respect to his views and his expert opinion, Mr. Speaker, if I do say so, on this matter. Mr. Speaker, these are the kinds of things that Mr. Kent might say to us, to the member from Hammonds Plains, if he had an opportunity to talk to Mr. Kent. He might say that making it harder to cheat is not enough. Effective policing also requires penalties. effective policing also requires appropriate penalties when cheating is nevertheless attempted. And I find this quite interesting given the history of the Liberal trust funds in the province of Nova Scotia. Mr. Kent says, prison sentences are not to be taken seriously. They are not appropriate, and the courts will rarely impose them. But the alternative fines now provided by the legislation are too small to be an effective deterrent to attempts at major evasions. Essentially, Mr. Speaker, what Mr. Kent is saying is you need to give legislation teeth, but you can't be unrealistic about what you're going to expect the courts to impose, because the courts will not imprison people. And we certainly saw that, didn't we, Mr. Speaker, in the past? The courts are reluctant to go that far. However, what he is suggesting is that there should be really very, very strong fines. But the other thing that he recommends, which I think is really very interesting, is the role of the Electoral Commission in policing or enforcing any changes. And Mr. Speaker, given that this government didn't have the courtesy of even consulting with the Nova Scotia Electoral Reform Commission with respect to Bill 117, I think it is not unrealistic whatsoever for members of this legislature to ask for a period of 6 months to have a process where the Electoral Commission have an opportunity to comment on Bill 117. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Kent talks about effective enforcement of electoral reform and using the Electoral Commission to do this. He says that electoral commissions need to have sufficient staff, have independent probes. They need to have sufficient power to impose fines on not only the donor, but also on the recipient. And he suggests that fines be 5 times the offending amount. Now, I'm not sure, Mr. Speaker, if you look at the sponsorship scandal and what occurred there, those would be hefty little fines, for example, on the Federal Party of Canada, wouldn't they, Mr. Speaker? So, Mr. Speaker, there are many elements of electoral campaign reform. Electoral campaign financing reform is not a one-off kind of exercise that you can do easily, you can do without study, without thought, without debate, without public consultation, without consultation of all of the parties that are on the floor of this legislature and that are identified in this province. And Mr. Speaker, there are parties in this province who aren't in this legislature. We have a Green Party in this province. And Mr. Speaker, it seems curious to me that the government would put in place a process of electoral campaign reform without consulting with the other political parties, including the Green Party in this province, who I think would have a very interesting message for the government as a fresh party that are not as established or entrenched in some of the old practices. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure they would bring forward some very interesting thoughts on how we might improve electoral campaign reform. So, Mr. Speaker, it seems to me that if we had a period of 6 months to reflect on the legislation, to hear from the public, really think through the implications of this legislation, we would certainly be much better off, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I certainly in the constituency I represent and in the party that I am a member of, my views about corporate financing to political parties are well known, Mr. Speaker. It's not that I think there's anything wrong with corporations or the corporate sector, Mr. Speaker. Quite the contrary. Corporations, businesses, the corporate sector have a role to play in our province and in our society. But, Mr. Speaker, they have no role to play, in my opinion, in the democratic process, and they certainly have no role to play with respect to being given equal stature as a citizen or a voter, Mr. Speaker. And the problem I have with Bill 117 is, in fact, Mr. Speaker, it is the corporate sector who continue to have the more advantageous position in this legislation. Mr. Speaker, this is not, it's no longer acceptable to many, many people in our province to continue to allow corporate entities, and yes, Mr. Speaker, it's not acceptable for other organizations as well that are not voters to have an ability to influence the political process, Mr. Speaker. And I think if we took the time, and 6 months is not an inappropriate period of time, Mr. Speaker. It's, you know, if you consider today is close to the end of November, and Christmas and New Year's will be in there, Mr. Speaker. If we took time.
Order, please. There's too much chatter in the chamber. The honourable member for Halifax Needham has the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if we took time to reflect more thoughtfully on Bill 117, and if we consulted with people like Mr. Kent, for example, who has studied campaign financing for many, many years, is a very senior, and not a former politician, but pretty close, an elder statesman, an elder in the political process in our country, I think we would benefit greatly from the kinds of advice that we would get. Mr. Speaker, the final issue I'd like to turn my attention to is an issue with respect to being a woman in politics, Mr. Speaker. It's not something that I stand in my place and speak about very often, Mr. Speaker, because on some level I think that we're here and I'm here among equals. But, Mr. Speaker, I know that many women are intimidated about the very idea of running for political office, and how will they raise the kind of funds that are required to be competitive. It's not about not being able to raise money, Mr. Speaker, for women. It's about not being able to raise money and be competitive when, in fact, you're in a situation where you're very often running against candidates who are men, who we know that the vast majority of men earn, they have greater earning power than women. They're maybe connected to professions and political groups that have higher earnings, and their networks tend to be a little different. And Mr. Speaker, I hear this over and over again. I'm frequently invited to speak to groups of young women who are in political science at Mount St. Vincent, where in fact I'll be speaking tomorrow evening, Mr. Speaker. It's a paid announcement. You know, I think we really need to take the time to reflect on this bill in terms of what does it do to level the playing field between men and women and other groups as well, Mr. Speaker, who would dearly love to become involved in the political process as candidates and to run and represent their constituents and their province, but feel incredibly intimidated by this idea that they're just not going to be able to be competitive in terms of raising money. Mr. Speaker, if we took 6 months to go out and meet with women's organizations and other organizations as well, Mr. Speaker, disability rights groups, and I mean, sometimes, Mr. Speaker, you look at the composition of our legislature and it doesn't really reflect the composition of our province all that well. And you know, we're underrepresented when it comes to Indigenous, Black, Mi'kmaq, people with disabilities, women, and Mr. Speaker, money does play a role in who offers for election and how confident people feel that they're going to be able to marshal the resources to mount a competitive campaign. So, Mr. Speaker, Bill 117 doesn't address this, but it could if we took the time to really reflect on meaningful campaign financing reform that would put in place a system that is much more fair, and it is a system that eliminates some of the inequity that the current system clearly, and all you have to do is look around the composition of the House of Assembly, clearly there's structural inequity in the current system, and Bill 117 doesn't really address that, but it could, and it could if we provided that sober thought that we would get over a period of 6 more months to have an opportunity to consider this, I think, fairly important point, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, there are many things that I've had an opportunity to address here. The other thing I think we need to be very cognizant of, Mr. Speaker, is the fact that we do have rather significant campaign election reform occurring on the federal level. And the process isn't complete yet. As you know, Mr. Speaker, the process began under the leadership of Mr. Chrétien, Prime Minister Chrétien. Mr. Kent, in his article, indicates that basically Mr. Chrétien, he calls it a deathbed kind of repentance, that he saw that there was a real need for electoral campaign reform at the federal level, partly because of the sponsorship scandal, perhaps, but more importantly, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Kent talks about the fact that Paul Martin had been able to raise $12 million toward his leadership, which pretty much shut out the capacity for anybody else in the Liberal Party who might be thinking about a run at the federal leadership from being competitive. And again, Mr. Speaker, it's the role that corporate money has played, especially corporate money in the Liberal Party. I think that has been so problematic, and And certainly Mr. Kent makes a strong argument, a strong case for why that is. I had to laugh, I had to chuckle, Mr. Speaker, when I read this piece. He talks about the then president of the Federal Liberal Party declaring the idea of limiting corporate and union contributions to the federal parties as being dumb as a bag of hammers, Mr. Speaker. And I understand that now that Mr. Harper has even tightened further those contributions under the PC, or under the Conservative Accountability Act, that Liberal senators in the Canadian Senate, that great paragon of democracy, with all of those appointees who've not had to run and face the electorate, are now fighting to prevent the Accountability Act from actually passing, which would be a great shame, Mr. Speaker. But I think what we really need to do, with all due respect, Mr. Speaker, is allow that process at the federal level to play itself out and see what lessons we can learn for our own electoral reform here in the province of Nova Scotia. And Mr. Speaker, I would think it will be at least 6 months, or it will be probably within the 6-month period before that process is complete. And that would give us an opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to really perhaps harmonize the legislation here in Nova Scotia with the federal legislation. It certainly would make things a lot easier for members of political parties and for the public at large, Mr. Speaker, because, you know, it can be very confusing for people when you have different sets of rules at different levels of government, Mr. Speaker. So I think that it wouldn't be unreasonable to hoist Bill 117 for a period of time to allow for that, for the Federal Accountability Act to either pass or perhaps never see the light of day, depending on whether or not there's a spring election and whether or not the government, the current government survives a spring budget vote. Mr. Speaker, you know, I think, and I said this at the outset when I stood up, that many people in our province care deeply about the political process, but many people have turned themselves off completely about the political process. And they've turned themselves off around the political process because they think that it is now a process that is dominated by particular interest groups, and they feel they have no hope of having any impact or any influence on the political process, and they don't see it working for them, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have, I think, been given a unique opportunity by the government when they've tabled Bill 117. We've been given a signal by the government that they are interested in doing something about the democratic deficit in this province. What they unfortunately didn't do is they didn't consult with anybody else in this legislature in terms of their views or their ideas around what democratic reform might look like. And Mr. Speaker, with all sincerity, the members of this caucus and myself as a member representing Halifax Needham would very much love to participate in a broader discussion around addressing the democratic deficit in the province. Campaign election financing is a small piece of that. Well, maybe not even a small piece of it. It's a fairly fundamental piece of that. It's not all there is to do with respect to addressing the Democratic deficit, but it's certainly part of it. And Mr. Speaker, it's a really important part of it. Mr. Speaker, I don't know when the last time was that this legislation was changed. I would suggest to you that it's been some years, Mr. Speaker, since this legislation was changed. And Mr. Speaker, it may be quite a long time in the future before it will be changed again. So, Mr. Speaker, we will have to live with this legislation for a very long time if we don't get it right. And the public in our province will have to live with this legislation a very long time if we don't get it right. Mr. Speaker, we have an opportunity here to really address the public cynicism around how political parties are funded and how election campaigns are financed. Mr. Speaker, a period of 6 months to consult on these matters is not unreasonable. And one of the things that I didn't talk about at all, Mr. Speaker, and I know my hour is about to expire, but Mr. Speaker, Bill 117 deals only with raising money. It's absolutely silent on spending money. And this is another thing that Mr. Kent talks about. And it's something that he says, and we all know, is equally as important. It's what are those parameters? What are the rules, the restrictions, the regulations, the requirements around how that money that gets raised is spent? This bill is silent on that. So we could be embarking on a significant process in the province of Nova Scotia in the next 6 months where we go out and we do some serious study, reflection, and consultation on election campaign reform that looks not only at how money is raised by political parties, but also how it's spent. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I got the dubious task, as usual, following the member here, and it's usually fairly difficult, but I'll do my best, Mr. Speaker, because this 6-month hoist is very, very important. You know, when on Bill 117, when the minister brought it forward, he threw down the gauntlet quite earnestly and said, look, we need this before November 30 or December 31st this year. And he did this without consultation with anybody, but told us the urgency of why and we need this bill. And our reaction, obviously, then, is to stay in debate. It's, you know, I think most of us around this room are fairly wise consumers. And if you walked in to buy a new car tomorrow, and the car was there, and the salesperson said, this is the price, you wouldn't say, 1 second, where do I sign? We want to make sure that the car is in good working order, Mr. Speaker. We may want to take it out for a test drive. We may want to look at the tires. We want to look at all those things. And it would take a considerable amount of time. It may not take 6 months, Mr. Speaker, but we'd want to do some real looking into this. But the minister, in introducing his bill today, challenged us, threw down the gauntlet and said, we need this bill. Without really consulting our House Leader or consulting our caucus in a substantive way. So leaves us this position to ask for this 6-month hoist so we can stay and debate the merits of this bill. Whether this bill is really a go-forward bill as it relates to election financing and electoral reform, Mr. Speaker, because these are issues. These are issues that are fundamental to democracy, that everybody is allowed to participate equally. So if we don't have a good grasp on that, a grasp that is open and transparent, then we have a problem. So the 6-month hoist, Mr. Speaker, is one that would give us this. Now, you know, some would say 6 months is a long time. Well, you know, last week in this House, the member from Halifax Needham asked the Minister of Environment and Labour why WCB is taking a year to make a decision on people with chronic pain. And the minister had no problem with that. Thought that was perfectly fine. These are people that can't get out to work, that have been waiting more than a year, but he seems to be perfectly satisfied that we're coming out, we're less than 10 days to the year being up on that matter, but he's all right with that. But this government doesn't think it's worthwhile enough to have 6 months to study this bill. It's all right to stay home in pain with no money, but if we ask for 6 months to stay home and find out if this is what can fix electoral financing, that seems to be bad. There's a disconnect here, Mr. Speaker. There's a real disconnect to all Nova Scotians when it comes here. So we want, by moving this 6-month hoist, is a debate on this bill. And this is what the legislative leverage we have, and we have to use it. Now, people may disagree with it, and that's part of this process. But disagree with it or not, this is our right, and this is our duty to our constituents, to stand up here and say, this is a bad bill, it's flawed, and we have to fight it. And one of the fights in this bill is a 6-month hoist. And if we could get this hoist going, we could say that we stayed here and we debated it and we found out the merits of the bill. And, you know, just seems to be out of nowhere, the minister started talking about the all-party committee on this. Well, that wasn't in the original Bill 117. So if he's talking now about some kind of tweaking, well, you know, we should then talk about, we should have 6 months to figure that out. But let's stay here and debate it. But to merely say, you have until the 31st of December or you're wrong, then the hoist, then that doesn't work. We're saying we need a good 6 months, Mr. Speaker. And that will make things much more transparent, much more clearer to the people of this province. There's many things in this bill that I think the vast majority agree on. But it's a matter of when someone drops a hammer down and says, okay, you know, the proverbial, I'll go back to the car sales thing, is you buy that by closing time today or the deal is off the table. Well, you know, Mr. Speaker, this is what the Justice Minister and the House Leader of the government is saying. You either buy that car off the showroom floor today or the deal's out and we're not going to do anything. Well, that's not the proper way to do these things, especially in a minority House, Mr. Speaker, when we have 6 months to decide what we're going to do in this minority House. When people will be considered already, if the party with the second amount of seats in this House were consulted, how many other Nova Scotians weren't consulted on this bill? We need a hoist, Mr. Speaker, in the worst way on this bill. You know, electoral reform has been long, long overdue, in particular as it relates to financial reform in this province, Mr. Speaker. And, you know, we're many times they will look at our party and say, well, you get money from big unions, and we talk about corporate donations. And my leader said in his speech today, take it all down to zero. You know, the fact of around people who quote unquote call them big unions, well, you know, the big unions are at least covered by a form of democracy where if they thought they were giving too much money to one party or over another, they can always kick them out. Well, corporations don't have that same leverage, Mr. Speaker. So, you know, but we will, in earnest, say, look, zero for everybody. Zero, that makes it fair. We'll take that step and say, look, it's zero for everybody. Like, why would you want to have, like, what's the purpose of having someone being able to get out in front of anybody else on this, Mr. Speaker? You know, when we look at campaign contributions from outside of Nova Scotia, which on its face may be a good idea, and I think there's a lot of good to it, but you need a 6 months of study. What happens to the person who has a connection to home that goes away just months before the election period, has their home back there, and maybe disenfranchised? They're not a resident. They're not a resident. Although they're sending money home to feed their family, then they're doing all these things, but they're out in the Premier saying they're a resident. Well, these things need to be explained to people, Mr. Speaker. They're a resident, he says. But these are things that have to be explained to the general public. But yet, you know, they don't want that 6 months to do that. They want this. The minister sees an urgency here, an urgency like no other, to get out and get this done with, and have it be done with earlier. So what's the deal about this, Mr. Speaker? Because, you know, this bill, while it's doing reform, it's much like finding a derelict somewhere and splashing shaving lotion on them. And you know what? Once the shaving lotion wears off, it still has the same odor. And that's the wrong with this bill, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 6 months. 6 months, Mr. Speaker. 6 months, Mr. Speaker. No, Mr. Speaker, this bill stinks. Mr. Speaker, that's a
I know the honourable member is trying to speak to the reason for the hoist in a very colourful way, but please in a more direct way. The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Well, Mr. Speaker, thank you, and I'll try to keep it more to the point and a whole lot less colourful. But you know, Mr. Speaker, it will be the same bill if we do not take avail of the 6 months to hoist it. Only 50 minutes to go. The Minister of Municipal Relations tells me 50 minutes to go. Well, let's hope that this is not like the last time we filibustered, him and I, and we're still friends, though. But you know, Mr. Speaker, whether it's, you know, I only want 50 minutes tonight, but I really need 6 months. 6 months, Mr. Speaker, you know. You know, Mr. Speaker, it's only been 6 months since the election. It's been less than 6 months since the election. Now, I know for a lot of us here it feels longer, but it's less than 6 months. It's just, so that, you know, if we could do that between there. Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you.
Thank you,
I'll
Tom.
now recognize the honourable member for Halifax-Chebucto on an introduction.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for allowing his talk to be interrupted just briefly so that I can introduce some visitors to the gallery, who are in the Speaker's gallery. Mr. Speaker, members of the House, I'd like to draw your attention to the presence in the Speaker's gallery of members of the 36th Halifax Scout Troop. There are 9 of them, along with 2 of their leaders. Mr. Howard Donoghue, well known, I think, to members of this House, and Mr. Stan Fage, who happens to have, as I understand it, a close relative who is a member of this House. So I wonder, since they're here to observe the democratic process in action, and no doubt they'll get a good deal of that this evening, I wonder if we could offer them the warm welcome of this House.
Thank you. The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
And welcome to the people in the gallery tonight. You know, again, I want to talk about the hoist, Mr. Speaker, and in particular, you know, when the minister talked about the necessity of the December 31st deadline, because I go back to the thought that this government's been in power for over 7 years now in one form or another, and why has the light gone on so quickly now that they have to have this done in just a little over a month? Why is that? Why don't we want this fully debated? You know, we have some problems here, Mr. Speaker, with that idea of rushing it through And so 6 months would give us the ability to get out, and all of Nova Scotians, the ability to find out where you, if you're a corporation and you know, are involved in a democratic process in an earnest and open way, then you would want to know, well, what are my bounds here? What can I do? What can't I do? You know, this past weekend our party had a fundraiser for an auction. Well, so where does this fall in the game? Maybe we'd need 6 months to study that, and so we could look in an honest way. But yet the government in 7 years really do not pay electoral financial reform any attention whatsoever, and then bam, in the what some would describe as the fading days of this sitting, need the bill and need it today. Like, even if they introduced this bill on day one of this sitting, Mr. Speaker, we'd only maybe be looking for a 5-month hoist. But, Mr. Speaker, this is what it's about. This is why we need a hoist. Why would you do this in what some would perceive as quite possibly have been the last week of this sitting of the legislature? Why? And I don't think that the Minister of Justice answered that question appropriately when he moved the bill today. The Minister of Finance, excuse me. That why after 7 years, and he's been in cabinet for all those 7 years, and I'm sure that came up and around at different times. Why this bill? Why this day? And that's a question that I think we've got to ask Nova Scotians from one end of this province to the other, and give us a 6-month period in which to do that. Because, you know, I think what we have right now on our plate is we've got a lot of Nova Scotians getting ready for the holiday season, and there's other things. They're trying to look after the family, and contrary to maybe some of us in here, they don't pay that much attention to us at this time of year. But if we gave them a full 6 months to look and absorb this bill and get real, genuine feedback from people in Cape Breton and people down in Yarmouth, right across this province, even Timberley Prospect, Mr. Speaker, you know. And we could go out, and I'll talk more on that later as we get into what the all-party committee would mean, because, again, I don't understand this. Like, with no contemplation of this in the bill, apparently out of the blue, the minister decides that that's the select committee. And it's been and you've been around longer than I have, Mr. Speaker, but it's always been my understanding and the pro forma. What we do here is an all-party committee. It's usually either at a leader-to-leader stage, or probably more appropriate house leader-to-house leader stage, that they would get together and discuss that out and say that you know, we can either work within that parameter or can't, and then we'll move it out from there. It's usually, that's how that's usually done. It's usually not laid out on the floor with no consultation with the official opposition. It's usually, there's usually some discussion. It's my understanding. I may be wrong, but I would I've been involved with 3 or 4 at least all-party committees, and that's the route they took. It was getting together and deciding that. Then out from that, what would grow from that would be, besides having just people from the legislature involved in an all-party committee, what you would also have is stakeholders. I have, as some of my friends in the third party and some in the government, one of the first tasks I had to do in '98 was we were involved with an all-party committee on WCB. Now, what we did, and that took us roughly, Mr. Speaker, about 6 months to do. And we went across the province, but not only as well exactly where we went, it's who we went with. Because what we did is we had people from all across the province, a cross-section of people from all across sectors that sat down. There was labor people involved, there was people with injured workers, there was business people, and these people sat with us. And so it wasn't just the political perspective, but it was the business perspective, the labor perspective, the injured worker perspective. So something like that, if that took us a 6-month hoist and went out and spoke to people in and around Nova Scotia to find out, you know, what is really in there. And you know, there'll be some places that You may need 2 meetings some places, maybe hardly anybody will show up. But the fact is, it's what we have to do. When we make a large movement in any direction, is to get the people involved. Nobody ran, I believe, in last June on the platform of overhaul electoral reform as it relates to the financing of campaigns. I don't think that was a major platform of any of the 3 parties. So I don't think that it's fair to do this in such a large way and do certain things and not include the public, because one could say that's nobody voted on that. So I would think a 6-month period of go out and do an all-party committee. Go do that all-party committee and then come back with a report that will be accepted by this House. At least, again, debate it in this House and don't put such a short time limit as what the Minister of Finance has put on this bill. And so this is what's necessary to do, because I think if you went out and in a 6-month time during this hoist and asked Nova Scotians, do you think, you know, should there be electoral reform as it relates to financing, they would say yes. Most would say yes and give their opinions of what's there. And it would give the idea, you know, of we could find out, is $5,000 the correct amount? Where did we pull that number from? I mean, the Minister of Finance, when he does the budgets for this province, just doesn't go and grab a number and say, oh, well, here's what I'm going to give this department, here I'm going to give that department. It has to be done on a meaningful way, and that's why we have debates in this House, and the purpose is to find out if that's an appropriate amount. Well, I would suggest to you, one of the purposes of my debate tonight, Mr. Speaker, is that I don't think $5,000 is an appropriate amount. And 6 months could tell us this, because on a personal level, I know back in my constituency, about this time last year, there was a resolve of the DevGo pension issue. Now, what happened with that, Mr. Speaker, that was a distribution of excess funds that were decided that it was owned by the contributors, which were the workers. Now, of that, many of the workers are deceased, and it left their widows to collect that money. Now, if you just indulge me for a minute, I am going to make a point here, Mr. Speaker, about this. And what has happened here, and it's a very serious point as it relates to the six months, is that these people collected the money and got it, and then when they applied for their guaranteed income supplement this year, many got $4,000 or $5,000, and it just put them over. Now, these are a lot of widows that have been disenfranchised from the GIS. Now, the federal government says, no. It's here's a high water mark. You either meet it, you get it, you go over it, you don't get it. And so these were people, had they had 6 months to consider their economic actions here, they may have said, look, the money isn't worth it to me because I'm going to lose more than I'm going to get in this pension refund. That was something. But not only 6 months here. These people have been disenfranchised for a full year. People on the lower strata, people making $14,000 and $15,000, and they were just lost it out because of a one-time lump sum payment that the workers should have been getting anyway, but yet because of a stroke of a pen, these widows have been disenfranchised for that money. And that's what 6 months would have done for them, and now they're out for a year. So, Mr. Speaker, 6 months. 6 months to consider the consequences of this bill is I don't think, a heck of a lot to ask, because the minister is saying the only opportunity, this opportunity falls off the table on December 31st. It's like the big ball, the big apple dropping by Dick Clark at Times Square in New York on New Year's Eve. When that falls, that's it. The year is over, the deal is off the table. I mean, you know, you can't do that with something that's going to mean as much as this bill will mean to how elections are run in the future of this province, to give basically, what is it, about 51 days. 51 days for Nova Scotians to decide this is the future of political contributions in this province. I say we need at least 6 months, a 6-month hoist, Mr. Speaker, because we don't know when we're ever going to revisit this again. So we need this 6 months. I mean, I don't know. A little water. But you know, Mr. Speaker, the all-party committee would go a long way, and I think that is one of the good things I heard from the from the finance minister today. But I would like to have seen that more in its fullness than just as an aside to this announcement. You know, our friends in the third party, we know about the trust funds. Mr. Speaker, why are we trying to legitimize them? I don't know. You know, I don't understand it. If the government members would stand up and tell me why they think this is an appropriate use of those funds. You know, it's a group of funds that were collected. We know that there was people taking to the courts of this province. They were charged and found guilty. A third one was let go in the Supreme Court, or the Court of Appeals in Canada, on a technicality. What more do we need? We punish people who don't put in that they worked a shift on EI, get a harder time financially than happened to those guys. But yet we want to legitimize those funds, and that's what we're doing. Make no mistake about it. That's what we're doing. We're saying once and for all, although there was 2 people found guilty for collecting that money, we're saying that money's okay. But you know, this is the only part of this bill that talks about how we spend money. This is they put a restraint on spending it, but it doesn't put any more constraints on it at all, Mr. Speaker. And we need 6 months to study that. We don't even know what the exact amount is in there. No. And so what we need is to find out the amount. We'll need. I would like to find out from government through this debate, or through, I hope, you know, I would like to know some quicker than 6 months of why would you have attached that rider, if you will, to that bill? Why is it important to speak of that and say we're going to legitimize that money? That befuddles me, Mr. Speaker, because it doesn't work. In fairness, it just doesn't work. We punish single mums in this province who go out and babysit while they're on community services, and if they happen to make a few bucks, they're punished by that. Oh no, I hear the Minister of Community Services, but I'll tell you, they are, Minister. Well, I'm going to tell you, you should come to some of my appeals then. I'll send you some of the documents, some of the appeals. The fact is, that they make a few bucks over and they're pushed. And this is, you know, yet we can talk in multi-millions of dollars, and that's okay. So that's a real problem, Mr. Speaker. So we've got to come up and say, you know, the trust funds just aren't the way to cleanliness in this province, if we're going to allow them to be a legitimate source of funding a party. Whether that funding is in the middle of an election or if it's between elections, it's just not right. And, you know, Speaker, the fact is that this is not something that's like in the far distant past that, you know, that we read about in history books, or even people say, look, some has happened. Some people maybe said in this house, this happened before I was born. But, you know, this line of kind of backdoor money problems with the Liberal Party is front and center, as it is with the Gomery that just finished. Yes, sir. It's something it's on the minds of people. It's people in Ottawa that are saying, look, this is not right. You know, the former minister in the Chrétien cabinet, Mr. Dingwall, who I've known for years, and Mr. Dingwall, who I honestly believe, Mr. Speaker, was working on behalf of his constituents, that was in Ottawa working hard as he could to bring what he could to his constituency, stood in front of, and it's no easy thing to do, Mr. Speaker, stood in front of a lot of his constituents and said, I have no bag of money. Now, I mean, some would say that was the undoing of a very popular. But you know what? At that same time, that bag of money was being exchanged in restaurants in Quebec. That's what the problem, that's what brings it home here. Here's a minister that I think was working the best he could. And I disagree a lot of things politically with him, but I think he had the best interests of his constituents, but was told, no, we got no money. But yet there was money being funneled elsewhere, behind his back. So, Mr. Speaker, this idea, this idea of tainted money around politicians, if you think it's a something for the history books, well, it's not. We haven't seen the complete rollout of Comrie. The Accountability Act is there and it's going forward, but where's the Accountability Act? Where is it being stopped? It's being stopped in the unelected Senate of this country. And so we want, doesn't the Tory cousins here in Nova Scotia see the dichotomy of what they're doing? That the same ones that are preventing reform happening federally, they want to do a favor for here in Nova Scotia. And I don't know what's to be politically gained from that, if there is anything. That's what I'd like to have answered. And 6 months may do that, Mr. Speaker. That if we had 6 months to decide what's going on, what's really happening in politics here when it comes to money. Because, everybody, when they see contributions coming by, most people don't differentiate, don't go to the other side of the ledger, down the side, or look the up and down of it. They just see the amount and say, this is too much. And that's whether it's the largest bank in this country or the largest union in this country. People, I think, have become so distrustful of us, saying, doesn't matter. You're not there for my interest. You're there for the interest with the one with the big bankroll. And my leader said, no. What we're going to do is zero. Zero, ordinary, everyday Nova Scotians, working women and men, will contribute to election campaigns with the provisions that's put in this act, Mr. Speaker. That's what we're saying. And 6 months would allow us to go out and talk to Nova Scotians, because they don't want their politicians beholden to anybody but them. And that's the way it should be. Now, I'm not saying we are. I'm saying most people in this bill, everybody, all 52 members in this House, come here with one thing in common, and that is to represent the people who put them here. But what we have to do is get rid of the air of cynicism. And this, with a 6-month hoist, Mr. Speaker, would help a long way and get rid of some of that cynicism. We could go around this province and find out, let's hear straight up from them what they think about their politicians, what they think about who gives them what. It's a bit of political hay for a couple of days when all the donations come out and the book comes out and everyone looks through it and finds out who gave what to whom and go off like that, Mr. Speaker, and then it's done away with by the media and a couple of people who are really involved in the process and want to know how it works, and so they look at it. But by and large, kind of the coffee shop type of talk, or when it comes when that story breaks, says, nobody. Yeah, one guy says, big unions is throwing too much money, and big banks are throwing in big corporations, and so there's that kind of precept around it that we have a problem here, and that problem should be zero donations, and then we can clean the slate. We know where it's coming from. Now, some people, there is a debate on the other side, should there be public funding of elections at all, and that's a whole other debate. It would probably take more than 6 months, so I'm not going to go down that road today, Mr. Speaker, but nonetheless, we need that type of talk. We cannot put a 52-day limit. 51. There's more members here than there are days left, Mr. Speaker, in this year to decide on this bill. So we need at least 6 months, and the hoist would work well. And as I said earlier, Mr. Speaker, that is part of what we're doing here today. We have, as the government runs the agenda, we also have certain tools in our toolbox to fight this bill. So, Mr. Speaker, this is one of ours, and we have to go, and we've got to argue the rightness of the bill, which we do, but conversely, we have to argue what I would call the wrongness of this bill, because it's not transparent enough. We have to go make sure that there's not a large chunk of millions of dollars out there that allows one party a hand over another. And why $5,000? It's, you know, it's like starting a 100-yard dash and allowing one runner to start from the 20-yard mark, Mr. Speaker. It just doesn't make sense. Everybody should start from the starting line. We shouldn't allow one person to be, one party, if you will, instead of a person, to go further down that out of the starting blocks. And again, I just can't say it enough that it's not even a matter of saying, like, that these monies were won in a lottery or something. Someone gave it to them. We all know where they came from. They came from, you know, like, from Nova Scotians, really, because what it was is the tailgating, and then what they did after that, I'm sure, the tailgating, that after that, that at the end of it, that Nova Scotians themselves paid that by the extra price on the shelf. So we've all paid for that. And we're asking to be fools with our own money. And it's not fair, Mr. Speaker. This stuff has to be straightened out. And that money cannot be allowed in that pot for any political purposes, whether it's during election time or between elections. That money has to be cleansed out of Nova Scotia. It has to be gone. It has, whether we give it to a charity, we put it in paying down our debt, but we have to get rid of it. And every right-thinking Nova Scotian thinks that way, Mr. Speaker. We don't want it, and we don't need it. So we would have 6 months. Let Nova Scotians decide who's the best ones to tell us this, Mr. Speaker. Because the transparency, as I said earlier, is not there. So, you know, what the other side of this bill, and again, we're being told about the urgency of this bill, yet the Election Reform Commission was not within 100 miles, so to speak, of this bill, Mr. Speaker, that they weren't asked for their input. We all believe that in the role of the Election Reform Commission. We understand what they do. All three parties have people on that commission, and I think we all have darn good people on it, Mr. Speaker. And these are people, if they had this bill for 6 months, could probably give us some very good insight on this. And that would be a welcome addition to this hoist, Mr. Speaker. Allow them to go out and look at this bill and tell us this is what's good and what's not so good in this bill, Mr. Speaker. But yet, this government chose just to do an end run on these folks. They went out and said, no, you're of no value in this. We're not going to consult with you. We don't need your input. We don't need your valued input that could, you know, we all got the stuff last week, and we got some stuff from the chief returning officer and her position on selection reforms and so on. Some very valuable issues and issues that should be discussed in this House, and some of them will be, no doubt. But this is, to say that a august group was just pushed aside, one has to wonder why. Why is that group pushed aside, and then this group, this House, be told that you have until December 31st, 2006 to decide what's in here? So we need this 6 months, Mr. Speaker. We need this 6 months so we can vet it through a group like that. Not, you know, and they could come back, I'm sure, and tell us that the rightness and the wrongness of some positions around this bill, and that's what's needed. You know, do we really, you know, one of the thoughts around, some people said earlier, that it's about participation in our democracy, and they talk about, you know, participation as it pertains to actual voting has declined, and what we can do to make it easier for people to vote. And I remember not this election, but 2003. I remember we had trouble getting one gentleman registered to vote on election day, and it was becoming really onerous on the workers. So finally, at the end of it, they called the clerk here, who basically said his sage wisdom to them: it's about getting people to vote, not to vote. That's what it was. It wasn't about putting up bars. It was about taking them down. And it was a wise decision, and we got that person to vote that day, Mr. Speaker. And that's what that's about. That's about this, what this system should be about. It's about inclusion. It's not about excluding people. But yet what we want to do with this bill is set this arbitrary $5,000 limit. So I don't understand that, Mr. Speaker. But what we do need is we want to tell those people that probably aren't voting today and reach them, and it may take us a 6-month hoist to reach them, and saying that, no, this system is working, that democracy works here and it's transparent. You know, just a couple of weeks ago, we had out in front of this house, we had a rally for our women and men overseas and in the services. And what was the theme, speaker after speaker, was that these people, and especially in Afghanistan, can embrace democracy. That's what we stood there. Every member of this House stood out there and supported the ability for people to embrace democracy. And that's all we're asking for today, Mr. Speaker, around Bill 117 is a 6-month hoist, so people in our province can participate in democracy, in the Joe Howe style of democracy. So this is what we need. I'll wait for that to... You're a wise speaker. You know, this is the type of, you know, that we need the ability to go out and speak to Nova Scotians. As Joe Howe would want us to participate, that's what we need here. We need every Nova Scotian. We don't need artificial deadlines with artificial monies amounts, Mr. Speaker. We need is real participation by real Nova Scotians with real financial goals to meet, not some arbitrary $5,000. Now, you know, it would be interesting to go through the exercise of, say, the last 10 years and go line by line with parties and find out what was the amount and what it would mean to certain parties if they were to lose that $5,000 line item in non-election years. That I think you may go towards part of the root of the problem. So if we could do that, we would probably be able to more kind of finite and say, okay, this is the reason for this. But I'm afraid when someone puts this $5,000 ante on the table and says you've got 50 days to make up your mind, I get kind of worried. I got to say, well, you know, what's in it for Nova Scotians? Did you ask the input of the merchants that are on Plummer Avenue in Waterford? Did you say, you know, what about this? Do you think this is a good idea? I would suggest not, Mr. Speaker. But if we had a 6-month hoist, maybe, you know, I could go and I could ask them, and people that could be seen to be less biased than me could go ask them, Mr. Speaker, and we could fetter and we could poke in those and shine some light in some dark corners maybe in 6 months to find out where this whole rationale of $5,000 comes from. That would be fine. I think I don't know how democracy would become unhinged if we waited 6 months to have this bill passed. How does this affect democracy? Why did the minister not once did the Minister of Finance accept, but he said that he had to have it by December 31st, or that was it. Well, I don't understand. He didn't go on to explain that position. I don't know, you know, anybody else in the chamber, if they heard him, maybe they'll stand up after me and explain that to me. But I'm quite sure that he did not. He just said, look, we got to have this bill and we got to have it now. And, you know, as I said earlier, Mr. Speaker, that would scare me. I would not come in and, you know, buy something, give you this item to buy, and you've got to buy it now, you've got to buy it as is, and you can't, there's no negotiation. Well, this is too valuable of a piece of legislation to put those kind of artificial problems, artificial designs on it, Mr. Speaker. We have, you know, we debated earlier some other legislation that was the interlock and so on, and we talked about pieces of legislation that the government chose for years. I believe it was the third party that talked about this quite a bit, talked for years that they didn't bother to proclaim. It just sat on the books, not proclaimed. But for some reason, this has to be done in 51 days. What's the rush? Explain the $5,000. Make it transparent, Mr. Speaker. Let the people in this province know what's going on. If not, if you don't have true transparency, you will have people becoming more and more skeptical, and you won't be getting people getting involved in the process. You'll be getting people taken away from the process. You know, Mr. Speaker, it's been now 6 months since this government announced a sewer treatment plant for Dominion. That's not completed yet, but it's all right for the people of Dominion to wait over 6 months for a sewage treatment plant. But this government can't allow Nova Scotians to wait 6 months to see what's going on with their election finance reform. Tell me the difference. Tell me. I would say it's more urgent that in that time that people would have a clean beach to swim on and proper treatment of sewage. But yet this government wants us to make a snap decision on this like that in 51 days, not 6 months like we would ask for. They want it done and ready to go. They want this done. They want us, you know, I think if government would have their way, that would be, not only would it be proclaimed, but this would all be done by probably, I'm taking a wild guess, Thursday evening of this week. That's what government will want us to do. Well, you know, Mr. Speaker, I don't think our party is going to sign that check for this government. Mr. Speaker, we want this hoist, and we're trying to get maybe some people in the government side and some people in the third party to see where we're coming from on this. That this is, Nova Scotians want this. That's, you know, it's to cleanse the system. We don't need to build up any more cynicism, Mr. Speaker. We're overflowing with that, and that's what we need. But yet, we need this. We have a government that wants to get out of this house this week, and at the peril of what it may need for futures of Nova Scotians. So we have to, Mr. Speaker, really think this one through. And a 6-month hoist would be the perfect opportunity. You know, we've had many. I talked earlier about you know, all-party committees. We've had all-party committees on fire safety. We had all-party committees on various items, Mr. Speaker, on electoral boundaries. Member from Glace Bay wants me to say Cisco, so I'll say Cisco, but I was never on that one. And so, but that wasn't an anyway. I digress, Mr. Speaker. As much as I love to banter with the member from Glace Bay, and as much as I respect his view and his intelligence, I have to get through this. I guess he's going to tell us later. But anyway, you know, Mr. Speaker, we had an all-party committee on election boundaries, and then I sat on that, and then we moved it off to a non-political body after that. But nonetheless, we did it, and we went out and found out voters' input about boundary lines and so on. But yet, this government doesn't seem that how you finance that, the next step, to be this important, that we could go out to all Nova Scotians and say, look, this is a problem. That how do you find election financing is good, and it's, you know, it's, look, don't get me wrong, Mr. Speaker, it's not something people, when they get their feet on the floor and before they get their first cup of coffee or a cup of tea in them in the morning, the first thing comes to mind is, oh, I wonder how they're paying for those elections. I realize that, Mr. Speaker, but the fact is that it is something, when it's all said and done, when it is about spending their tax dollars, it's about allowing us to have access to that, and that's part of when we come here, that we swear, I guess, to uphold a lot of principles, and one is that all of us are responsible for spending our tax dollars wisely, and that means from the government perspective of doing up the budget, and I think it's from the opposition's perspective to keep them on that straight line on that. But, you know, that's not always the case. The case from time to time is we disagree vehemently with the direction the government takes. And this is 6-month hoist is one of the tools that we have available to us to slow this kind of runaway freight train down. That we agree that financial reform as it relates to elections is a good thing. We believe that this should be a go-forward proposition. We do not agree with using tainted money in that system. We do not agree with setting artificial limits of $5,000 that nobody can comprehend of why you come up with that. I said to you earlier, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Finance, if he went and put the finances of this province and said, here's a number, and nobody was allowed to ask him, that would be a problem. So just all we want to know is why 5,000? And Nova Scotians, we may go around Nova Scotia and say, man, I'm fine with that. That doesn't bother my sensibility. But, you know, I've got to say, I got to come back and talk to the widows in New Waterford.